Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, wolves, weasels, and coyotes, carnivores of North America, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Rylee Jensen. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Over to you, Rylee.
Thank you, Rob. This is my first Daily Dose webinar, and I'm talking about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart and that I could go on about forever. So I'm very excited to talk to you all about carnivores today, including the smallest weasels all the way up to our favorite wolves and bears. So first, just a little bit about me. I got hired on with NatHab this year as an expedition leader, and I spent all of July guiding Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks, which are basically a second home to me. As you can see from the picture on the right, I'm also a wildlife photographer, so I carry my camera with me wherever I go, and I love to take pictures of wildlife. That's kind of how I got into the guiding industry in general. As far as my background goes, I have a bachelor's degree in wildlife ecology from Utah State, and I'm actually currently a graduate student right now at Northern Michigan University, where I'm studying gut microbiome diversity in African herbivores. So I am trained as a biologist, and I've been kind of in this world since 2015. So wildlife is really my bread and butter, and carnivores especially are one of my peak interests and animals that I'm very familiar with. So before we begin, we're just going to kind of get into taxonomy a little bit. So as you can see on this phylogenetic tree, this is the order Carnivora. So carnivores that I'm going to be talking about today all come from this order. And you can see it's divided by feliforms and caniforms. So the further back on this tree you go, the further to the left, this kind of signifies longer evolutionary time. So feliforms and caniforms split off from each other a long time ago into these different families that you can see. So feliforms encompass a variety of families, felids, of course, so these are wild cats, but then we also have animals such as hyenas, mongooses, so these are all closely related species. So hyenas are actually more closely related to mongooses and some of these weasel type animals than they are dogs, which a lot of people may not know about. And then on the bottom panel, we can see caniforms. So these are canid-like animals, and this encompasses everything from wild canids like coyotes, wolves, jackals, to bears, such as black bears, polar bears, grizzly bears, and even pinnipeds like seals and sea lions. And we also have some of our more familiar weasel-like species, so mustelids, as well as procyonids, which are raccoons, Mephididae, which encompasses skunks. So you can see that this order of carnivora encompasses a wide variety of different species which live in very diverse habitats, from marine and freshwater ecosystems to African savannas and snowy mountainous regions in Canada and Alaska. So there's plenty of different habitat types that they encompass, lots of very diverse diets, which I'll talk about right now. One important thing to keep in mind about carnivora is that this doesn't necessarily mean that all animals within this order are carnivores. So bears are a really good example of this. In the top left picture, this is a giant panda. And you can really classify pandas as more herbivores than carnivores because 99% of their diet is bamboo. It's truly amazing that they've made it this long, evolutionary speaking, on just this diet of pretty much a single plant species over time. So pandas are a really good example of just a very split off diet from most other bear species. But then we have coastal brown bears in the middle picture here. And they also have a pretty diverse diet depending on the type of year, on the time of year. So in May and June, as they're coming out of the den, they typically will graze on grasses and sedges and meadows, and their diet's almost entirely plant material at that time. In July and September, this is when the salmon run really begins, and so they're just gorging themselves on sockeye salmon, chum salmon, and that's pretty much their main diet source during those months. So they're really trying to fatten up on salmon. It's a really high protein diet. And then in August, they'll actually turn to berries. So they need that input of berries as a carbohydrate so they can balance out the high protein that they're getting from salmon. So I included a picture here of Devil's Club. There we go. Devil's Club. So in coastal Alaska, especially in Southeast Alaska, this is a favorite diet of coastal brown bears. And it's estimated that one coastal brown bear in Southeast Alaska can actually consume around 100,000 Devil's Club berries in a single hour of foraging. So they can be really heavy on the plant material. Additionally, grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem rely pretty heavily on whitebark pine seeds as a staple part of their diet. This can make up around 80%, vegetation material itself can make up around 80% of their diet throughout the year. And whitebark pine seeds are really give them that high caloric intake that they need to prepare for hibernation. So this is why grizzly bears, for example, in interior Alaska and in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem are actually a bit smaller in stature than coastal brown bears because they don't have that consistent protein diet throughout the year that the coastal brown bears do. So you can see with just these three species alone, their diets are very, very diverse and very different from each other. And then you also have another far end of the spectrum, polar bears, which are obligate carnivores and primarily eat marine mammals as their staple part of their diet throughout the year. So going further with carnivores, we can kind of categorize them into these two main groups. So we have apex predators or hypercarnivores and mesocarnivores. There's a couple distinguishing features between these two groups that is generally consistent throughout. So we have some basic characterizations such as size, their abundance levels, diet, and reproductive capability. So apex predators being at the top of the food chain are typically larger because they usually eat larger prey items. A lot of them are obligate carnivores, but as I just showed you with bears, this doesn't always hold true. They're also typically less abundant. So they need large home range sizes, large territories. So in the case of wolves, for example, they're going to be a lot less abundant on the landscape than, say, raccoons. Like I said, apex predators typically stick to a carnivorous diet of meat. About 90% of their diet may be meat, whereas mesocarnivores are typically all going to be omnivorous, which just like bears, meaning that they eat both plant and meat material. Also, apex predators are typically slower to reproduce than mesocarnivores, so they are slower to bounce back after their population takes a hit, for example, than mesocarnivores are. So with this in mind, classifying a mesocarnivore becomes a tad trickier when you think about their niche or their role in an ecosystem. So previous studies have classified mesocarnivores based on a certain size range, so say 1 to 30 pounds, or based on their diet. So 50 to 70% of their diet, if 50 to 70% of their diet includes meat, that would classify a mesocarnivore. But we've now come to realize that this niche, this role in their environment is actually more important for classifying mesocarnivores apart from apex predators themselves. So to understand ecosystem roles a bit better, we're going to talk about the concept of trophic cascades. So there are many definitions for what constitutes a trophic cascade, but the general consensus suggests that it's species interactions that have consequences through multiple trophic levels within an ecosystem. In simpler terms, a trophic level can refer to a species' place on the food web. So this is a concept that has been documented by famous naturalists such as Charles Darwin, Robert Payne, Aldo Leopold, and it's gotten a lot of popularity in the last few decades or so among people just interested in ecology and nature in general. So originally, ecologists also thought that this meant only predators controlling prey populations, but we now know that this has much more far-reaching effects. And that these effects are bidirectional, meaning that living things at the very bottom of the food chain can have rippling effects all the way to apex predators. So a lot of what happens under the surface, whether that's under the water or under the soil, can have far-reaching effects all the way up to apex predators. So thus comes the concept of top-down and bottom-up effects. So top-down effects are apex predators influencing lower levels of the food web through hunting, through a landscape of fear, which is another concept I'll talk about in a minute here. Whereas bottom-up effects start with primary producers or autotrophs, such as plants, which influence populations of consumers, such as herbivores, which then influence top mesopredators and top predators, apex predators. So many times these effects happen simultaneously. This is not just a simple one-way system. It's a lot more complex than that. So I'm going to use Yellowstone as an example of both of these effects, since it is such a rich biodiverse ecosystem, and it's been an excellent model system for our researchers to study over the years to look at these different effects. So an example of a bottom-up effect is invasive lake trout in Yellowstone Lake. So lake trout were introduced to the nearby Shoshone and Lewis lakes around 1890, and they made their way to Yellowstone Lake about 100 years later. The reason was just to promote more fishing opportunities for anglers, and so at the time, everybody thought this would be a great idea. But lake trout are much larger than the native cutthroat trout, which originally inhabited Yellowstone Lake and still do to some extent. Lake trout also spend much more time deeper in the lake, and they spawn in these deep areas of the lake rather than river tributaries like native cutthroat trout do. So their ecologies and their natural behaviors are fundamentally different. So with lake trout outcompeting these cutthroat trout for resources, as well as directly killing them, the cutthroat trout population really began to take a hit and drop pretty drastically. So without as much cutthroat trout spawning in inland rivers, this actually affected the predators that once preyed on cutthroat trout. So this affected grizzly bears, which in turn, because they could not fish for lake trout in these river tributaries, and there weren't as much cutthroat trout spawning in these river tributaries anymore where grizzly bears frequented, they then turned to hunting elk calves much more frequently. Similarly, bald eagles, which would hunt for cutthroat trout closer to the lake's surface, and that now had to turn to hunting swan cygnets and other bird species in order to supplement their diet. This also directly affected ospreys as well, which are a very famous fishing bird predator here. So ospreys were no longer nesting closer to the lakeshore. They kind of moved more into inland areas to try to find another consistent food source. So that was a good example of a bottom-up effect of trout kind of impacting the food web all the way to apex predators and then back down to those other prey species. So apex predators also exert top-down control on mesocarnivores, herbivores, and primary producers like plants. Once again, trophic cascades are very complex. Yellowstone is a very famous example of this, though it is a bit blown out of proportion from what a lot of people have come to know about it. So as the story goes, gray wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995. They reduced the elk population through hunting. They created a landscape of fear where elk kind of had to look over their shoulder a lot more often and be more vigilant. So they spent less time foraging riverbanks on aspens and willow trees. So because elk were spending less time browsing, those trees regenerated. They brought back trout because they now created shade over these different riverbank systems. Songbirds and beavers also came back to the park. And because these willow and aspen trees were now stabilizing the riverbanks, the rivers meandered less and were stabilized. So it's a great story, it's a great concept, but it is not as simple as that. So also simultaneously going on at the time of wolf reintroduction, there were other factors that impacted aspen and willow regeneration. So there was an increased water table level, which is just in general good for plants, especially riparian plants such as aspens and willows. There was a cow elk hunting season, I believe in 2004, which also significantly reduced the elk population because wildlife managers also noticed that elk were very overpopulated at the time of wolf reintroduction. And there was some previously harsh winters that all kind of coincided with the initial reintroduction of wolves, and winters are especially harsh on ungulates, which need to forage for food beneath the snow. So a lot of these effects, these simultaneous effects on the elk population were seen, years down the line. So a lot of people attributed these changes to wolves alone, kind of like promoting them as like the saviors of Yellowstone. But in conclusion, it's kind of hard to pinpoint wolves as the only effect on this ecosystem and the only reason for these changes in the park. However, there was another study done in Yellowstone published by Michael Cole and others in 2019, where they looked at another predator in the park, which are mountain lions. So both apex predators, mountain lions, and wolves have a significant effect on elk behavior. And they found that elk actually alter their daily spatial and temporal movements by the presence or risk of predation from both wolves and cougars. So wolves are coursing predators. So just like this picture shows, they need to run their prey down in order to exhaust them. And so they're typically found in more open valleys, and they need that open space where they can run in order to do this. So they also do a lot of their hunting during crepuscular hours, so dawn and dusk. So what they found with this study was that elk spent more time in open valleys at night when wolves were going to be less active. And they knew that they would be more safe there because wolves were not doing a lot of their hunting at night. Whereas cougars, on the opposite hand, are ambush predators. So they need to hide and stalk their prey in order to successfully hunt them. So they tend to do a lot of their hunting in really rugged terrain, near forest edge habitats, as well as doing a lot of their hunting at night. So the study also found that elk spent more time in forest edges and rugged areas, which is a typically good cougar habitat. They spent time there during the day when they knew cougars were resting or otherwise just not hunting, not expending their energy, so they could be safer there from wolves, which were then more active during the day hunting in these valleys. So it's clear what kind of effect apex predators can have on an ecosystem since their influence is a lot more obvious. But with mesocarnivores, their role can become more complicated in multi-carnivore ecosystems with multiple trophic levels. So in the figure on the right, we can see multiple predators in this picture. So we have wolves in the back, which then affect coyotes, which is the animal sneaking around the bush. Feral cats are also present in a lot of ecosystems, so those are included as mesocarnivores oftentimes. And then we have coyotes hunting rats, which and also hunting lizards. So, and then you have lizards hunting spiders, and then spiders hunting dragonflies. So there's multiple trophic levels going on here and multiple interactions taking place. But if wolves were removed from this ecosystem or removed from this equation, coyotes would then become the apex predator. So this is a concept known as mesocarnivore release. So once you remove an apex predator from an ecosystem, mesocarnivores are much more likely to jump in abundance and kind of take over the place. And apex predators can directly suppress mesocarnivore populations in this way through direct hunting, also known as intraguild predation. So that's one reason why mesopredator release happens. And many carnivores will change their behavior in response to the risk of predation. So in a study conducted in 2015 by Roland Kays and others, they found that in protected areas around North Carolina, where coyotes were present, feral cats were almost non-existent in these areas. They just simply did not want to be in areas where coyotes were active and where they were most abundant. Whereas in urban areas, cats actually changed their daily activity pattern to reduce the risk of predation from coyotes. So coyotes were a lot more nocturnal in these urban areas, probably to avoid people and vehicles during the daytime. And then feral cats shifted their activity patterns to become more diurnal so that they could directly avoid coyotes in time and space. So this has trophic effects as well. So when coyotes suppress cat populations, this is likely much better for small mammal populations, as well as bird biodiversity, because cats are known to have a really significant impact on local bird populations. So in turn, coyotes are having a direct effect on birds and that prey population. Whereas in urban settings, this may not always be the case, but with coyote presence still there, it's clear that cats are also altering their behavior. So that's one way that apex predators might impact mesopredator populations, but they can also help them by provisioning carcasses. So in a study published in 2021 by Joel Ruprecht in Oregon, which took place in Oregon, and it was actually a project that I helped collect data for, and I was a part of in 2018. They were collaring cougars and coyotes with GPS collars and tracking their movements, as well as looking at how they interacted on a landscape in this way. And they found that coyotes frequently ate from carcasses killed by cougars. And they were actually attracted to these kill sites because they knew that they could get that reward of a carcass when the cougar had its fill and decided to abandon the carcass. So even though cougars can and will kill coyotes occasionally, including in this study area, they also directly help coyote populations in this way. So taking a step further, carcasses left by apex predators after a kill, such as the pictures you can see in the top left with raccoons and possums, mesocarnivores will take their turn scavenging on these carcasses until it's basically just skin and bones. But then decomposers in the soil will help further break down this carcass and provide nutrients from that carcass and return it to the soil and return it to the plants in that ecosystem. So apex predators can indirectly help plant populations in a localized ecosystem as well. So along with scavenging carcasses and acting as an ecosystem cleanup crew of sorts, mesocarnivores also control rodent populations pretty heavily. So mesocarnivores actually help us in that way, where they can reduce rodent-borne diseases such as hantavirus. So they keep those disease levels down and keep diseases from spreading throughout an ecosystem, especially as we hear about more diseases with deer, for example. Carnivores and predators definitely play their part in reducing the spread of that disease. Unfortunately, we didn't know all of this 300 years ago. So while settlers and white settlers were moving across North America, they documented their encounters with large predators as they encountered them. And there was really just this attitude of fear towards predators that was very, very prevalent among people throughout the 1700s and 1800s as they were encountering grizzly bears and wolves for the first time, having come from Europe and England. They didn't really understand their ecology or their behavior well. And we've all heard of, biblical verses of wolves portrayed as deceivers and enemies of people. So like a wolf in sheep's clothing. So was this cultural fear of predators as well. Additionally, a lot of people who decided to settle out west saw wolves as a threat to their livelihoods because of cattle predation. There weren't really well-known ways of how to coexist with them at the time that they knew of. So it was just much easier to kill them than learn how to coexist. So throughout the 18th and early 20th century, there was a massive predator extermination campaign. There were wolfers hired by ranchers to kill entire packs of wolves. There were killing contests, predator roundups. There were poisoned carcasses that were left out on the landscape, which really took a toll on scavengers that rely on these carcasses, like I've just mentioned with coyotes feeding on carcasses provided by mountain lions. They even had bounties of $20 to $50 per wolf to turn in because their main goal was really just to kill off as many predators as they can. So $20 to $50 bounty is about $460 today. So it was a pretty lucrative business if they could be a part of that. And once again, they didn't see it really a role for predators in these ecosystems. They were just out to kill things, and that was all they did. So in 1885, the U.S. Bureau of Biological Survey was created, and they really became this agency that aided in this predator extermination campaign. So together with the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Park Service, National Park Service, they were all hired to eradicate carnivores, especially from cattle ranges where people were grazing their cattle. Coupled with the lucrative fur trading industry, an era throughout the 1800s where people were coming out west to trap beavers and all sorts of fur-bearing mesocarnivores to trade, many carnivores were completely extirpated or killed off in these areas throughout the United States. So today, we still see the effects of this. There are no gray wolves or grizzly bears in the eastern and southern parts of the US. There's still a small population of Florida panthers that are hanging on in Florida that are genetically distinct from mountain lions and cougars that we see out west because their population was so heavily reduced during that time. They just simply couldn't, interbreed with each other. So luckily, we now have some carnivores starting to disperse out east and kind of back to their historic home ranges. But a lot of this era still has these rippling effects in today's world. However, there's one animal that escaped this era relatively unscathed, and that was the coyote. So they have kind of become this symbol of resiliency across North America and beyond. And in fact, they've expanded their range even more than the pre-1800s extermination era. So coyotes are now present all throughout the eastern coast and the eastern United States where they weren't before. And they really just have an amazing ability to bounce back after hunting pressure. And there's a few main reasons why this is the case due to their natural history. So first, there was a lack of apex predators. So a lot of people had their attention on exterminating wolves in this era. Wolves are typically the apex predator that suppress coyote populations, even today where wolves are present. So with wolves being killed off throughout the United States, coyotes kind of saw this empty niche to fill and ability to take on that role as apex predators in these empty areas where there were no longer wolves. This goes back to that concept of mesocarnivore release. So they would group up in packs to hunt larger prey species, and they really were thriving pretty well. So that was one reason why. And secondly, they have a pretty generalist diet. So coyotes will eat almost anything that they come across. So they eat large prey like mule deer, all the way down to small rodents and even seeds and berries during the summertime. In a study conducted in Grand Teton National Park, they found that coyotes preying on abundant jackrabbits actually helped pronghorn fawn survival. So coyotes in that ecosystem preferred to hunt jackrabbits over pronghorn fawns, likely because they were easier to catch. But they found that in areas without jackrabbits, coyotes easily switched back to hunting pronghorn fawns as their next preferred prey species. And this is different than other predators you might find, such as lynx, that rely really heavily and they're really specialized on a particular type of prey item like snowshoe hares. So as snowshoe hare populations plummet and then bounce back and then plummet again, lynx kind of follow that same trend. Coyotes, because of this diet where they can eat plant material and meat and garbage, they kind of just had a good time either way. They could eat whatever they wanted. Coyotes also have responsive reproduction. So basically this means that they will produce more pups or less pups given the conditions around them at the time. So there's this myth, I guess you could say, that coyotes take a census of other coyotes in the area through yipping and howling, and less responses triggers a physiological reaction of some kind. So female coyotes will then have more pups the following season. I haven't found any like real scientific papers to support this, but this is an example of responsive reproduction that could happen with coyotes. So they actually will produce more pups the following season if there's less competitors. That's kind of this theory. So with less predators, less competitors, there's less threat to their pups, there's more food to go around. So they will actually do really, really well in the absence of other coyotes. So in areas where there's a bounty on coyotes to help mule deer populations, it actually doesn't work because coyotes will just respond even better than they did previously when there were more coyotes before. Additionally, behavior is also really important to take into account in this regard, since a lot of people want to go after these older, larger coyotes to hunt if they're into coyote hunting. And with these older, more experienced animals gone, you have these younger, less experienced coyotes moving into their vacant territories, and they don't really know the rules per se. So this is actually when you get more predation events on like livestock, for example. So coyotes kind of have this really dynamic social structure in these ecosystems in that way. Coyotes are also very mobile. They do have established territories, but like most canids, once young males reach sexual maturity, they'll head out in search of mates in the winter time, especially around February, which is their breeding season. So once again, if older established coyotes are killed off, that opens up a territory for all of these youngsters to come in and compete and try to like take over that territory. And then just, again, they don't really know the rules per se. So this is when they might get into trouble with people. And overall, coyotes are really just one of the most adaptable mammals on the planet. You can see from these photos, they can be found in some of the most opposite climates on Earth. So I took the picture on the left in Tucson, Arizona, and the picture on the right in Yellowstone in the dead of winter. So their current range extends as far north as Alaska and all the way down into Central America, and as far west as the Pacific Northwest, down to the humid tropics of Florida. So they can alter their physiology a bit, evolutionarily speaking, at these different localized ecosystems, depending on the climate, depending on food resources, and just the type of ecosystem that they inhabit. Another pretty cool fact about coyotes I wanted to throw in here too is that they've been known to cooperate with other mesocarnivores like badgers to hunt food. So this pairing up typically happens in late summer when they target really fat ground squirrels that are preparing to hibernate for the winter. So coyotes' responsibility is to pinpoint ground squirrels, sniffing them out using their keen sense of smell. Badgers will follow along or vice versa. And it's the badger's job to really dig up this ground squirrel with their powerful legs and claws. So they have a remarkable ability to dig very quickly. And so once a badger pulls up with the ground squirrel, either the badger or the coyote will get the reward from that. So this is a teamwork that's probably been going on for thousands of years between these two species, and they've just figured out that hunting together is much more successful than just hunting alone. So going back to the fact that coyotes can be found in a diverse amount of ecosystems, this is a picture of a coyote in clearly a very urban area and a very large city. And in fact, they've been found in almost every major city in the US, from Seattle and Portland on the West Coast and Los Angeles to New York and Chicago. In fact, they've been documented denning under highway culverts in Chicago and using dens in Central Park in New York City. So they're incredibly adaptable, and a lot of people don't even realize that they live alongside coyotes because of their nocturnal nature and just how elusive they're able to be and how well they're able to avoid human detection. And in fact, almost all mesocarnivores adapt to urban environments very, very well. So picture of a coyote on a train, on a subway, I believe that was taken in Chicago. I'm sure most people have seen raccoons or possums or foxes around your yards and neighborhoods. And a lot of the times the reason that they're drawn to these urban areas is because of food sources. So people if people are not securing their garbage very well, mesocarnivores will take advantage of this. And like I said, animals like coyotes and foxes have really diverse, capable diets. They're able to eat and switch their prey species pretty rapidly. So they'll take advantage of this left out trash and just use that as one of their primary food sources. So it's very important not to, to secure your trash properly, and also to not feed mesocarnivores if you encounter them, because then they become really accustomed to these urban areas and they're much more likely to be hit by cars, unfortunately. And jumping off of that as well, if they become too accustomed to getting handouts from people, they can become aggressive and bite people, which then actually just ends up worse for those mesocarnivores, because if they bite humans, they will end up getting euthanized. So mesocarnivores, additionally, because of food resources, they're also drawn to urban areas because there's protection from some of their natural predators. A lot of apex predators are not as tolerant of people, and not as tolerant of man-made structures in these type of ecosystems. So they can kind of seek refuge from predators like wolves or bears. And there's also unique shelter opportunities for them in man-made structures. I mentioned coyotes in culverts, raccoons will often den in attics, foxes will find dens pretty much anywhere. So they're extremely adaptable in these urban environments and ecosystems. So in the next couple slides, I'm going to highlight some mesocarnivore species you may find on NatHab tours, such as in Yellowstone, Glacier National Park, Grand Teton, Alaska, and also some lesser known North American mesocarnivores that a lot of people may not know about. So on this slide, these are all examples of mesocarnivores you might find around North America, from striped skunks, least weasels, badgers, to pine martens, foxes, and raccoons. So one of my favorite mesocarnivore species ever is the wolverine. So this is the largest terrestrial mustelid, so largest member of the weasel family, on land at least, and they're incredibly feisty. So their scientific name, gulo gulo, actually comes from a word meaning glutton So they've been known to kick wolves and bears off of carcasses. They're found at incredibly high elevations, and they're very, very elusive. They're very rare. So if you see one, count yourself wildly lucky, because it's not often that people see wolverines. They also have jaws of steel. So if you see the picture in the center that kind of shows a model of a wolverine jaw, you can see that the back molars on the maxilla, or the upper jaw, are actually rotated 90 degrees inward. And this is because wolverines, if they decide to take over a carcass, they'll, unlike most carnivores, eat everything from the meat to all the way down to the bones. So this extra like molar feature allows them to crush bones more easily. There's videos of wolverines also taking down caribou 3 to 4 times their size. So they're extremely tenacious. And there's actually an ongoing project with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in collaboration with a bunch of different government agencies and local state agencies to determine the relative population size and relative abundance of wolverines throughout the West. So as you can see in the picture on the right, they set up bait stations just like this throughout Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. So the purpose of these bait stations is to set up a carcass that entices wolverines to come to these stations. So the idea is that there will be a camera trap on the opposite tree facing the bait station, and as the wolverine reaches up to grab that carcass, it reveals their chest patch, which has a unique white fur pattern that's unique to every individual. So this is actually a great way to get individual ID on wolverines without needing to trap them, radio collar them, or ear tag them. This is a really non-invasive method for tracking wolverines, and some wolverines have been seen moving at a remarkable pace from bait station to bait station, up to like 50, 60 miles away within a matter of days. And it's all thanks to like being able to uniquely identify wolverines from these pictures. So I've also included a photo of this book. It's one of my favorite books by Douglas Chadwick called The Wolverine Way. And this is a great read, especially even if you're not a biologist. It just portrays wolverine ecology in a very easy to read manner. And he talks about, particularly when he worked in Glacier National Park on a wolverine project, they were fitting tracking devices on wolverines throughout the park and able to track their movements. He tells amazing stories about individual wolverines, how they're much more social than previously thought, especially males with like females and kits. And one of my favorite stories from this book talks about a wolverine that just decided to hike one of the tallest peaks in Glacier National Park for no reason other than that he just could. There wasn't any food at the top or mates or really anything else enticing him to that area. He just hiked all the way to the top of this peak and then all the way back down. And if that doesn't really show wolverine personalities, that's just who they are. Another species I wanted to highlight is the fisher. So these are sometimes known as fisher cats, but they're actually, once again, another member of the mustelid or weasel family. They also, despite their name, do not actually hunt fish. They're actually specialized predators that hunt porcupines. So they'll turn the porcupine over and meticulously eat them from the belly first to avoid the quills. And then they'll scavenge also on leftover carcasses or animals that died from natural causes, as you can see from these pictures. But like most other weasels, they're also tenacious hunters themselves, and they're a pretty unique member of the weasel family. So fishers need old growth forest habitat in order to survive. So this is why you find them in very forested areas throughout the country. So in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where I'm at currently, there's actually a pretty healthy population of fishers up here, and they really like to use tree snags and roots for their dens. They hunt snowshoe hares, small rodents, birds, berries, eat carrion. So these are all their prey species also need to rely on these forest ecosystems. Males actually can have a pretty large home range despite their size, which is around 6 to 20 square miles. Females' home range is a little bit smaller, 5 to 10 square miles. But fishers are known as an indicator species, so their presence or absence in these ecosystems can really point to forest health and show biologists how well a forest, how healthy and diverse a forest is, whether fishers are there or not. So unfortunately, fishers were hunted out of most of their historic range during the fur trading and carnivore extermination days of the 1700s through the early 1900s. but they have actually been reintroduced through much of their historic range, including in the eastern US and then more recently on the West Coast as well. So Washington is a really good example of this. Fishers were reintroduced to the state beginning in 2008. So this was a collaboration with Conservation Northwest, an organization up there, as well as the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, the National Park Service, many First Nations tribes, and the Calgary Zoo also joined in on this effort. So because their old growth forest habitat was still intact, especially in places like the Cascade Mountain Range and the Olympic National Park and the Olympic Peninsula, they still had an abundant prey source available for these fishers. So it really was the perfect site in order to reintroduce them back to these ecosystems where they belong. So fishers were translocated from British Columbia and the surrounding areas and reintroduced to national parks like Olympic National Park in 2008 up to 2012, Mount Rainier in 2016, and the North Cascades from 2018 to 2020. I believe the most recent reintroduction was in 2021. So as of today, a total of 279 fishers have been reintroduced to Washington. So their population is doing pretty well there, and they still have all of this natural habitat where they can thrive and just kind of reestablish their role back in this ecosystem. However, it's important to consider that climate change poses a risk to fisher habitat as well. So with these intense 100-year wildfires that we're seeing in the Pacific Northwest and California, Oregon especially, that really threatens old growth forest habitat, and it threatens to burn up these areas that fishers need to rely on in order to survive. Climate change also brings reduced snowpack, so that also may be a cause for concern for future fishers in the future. Another one of my favorite weasel species that I want to highlight are pine martens, also known as American martens, since they have a European counterpart. They're known as an arboreal species, which means that they spend most of their lifetime up in the trees, and that's really where they do most of their hunting and just thriving in these forests. So this photo of a marten I took in Yellowstone last January, and they tend to hang out in lodgepole pines. Yellowstone is a really good source of lodgepole pine forests, so martens are really comfortable there. So they're roughly the size of a house cat. They're rusty red with a bright orange chest and dark legs and tails, and they're known to den in areas like rock crevices, tree snags, in logs, and then sometimes in squirrel middens. So if you don't know what a midden is, this is a great example of that. So squirrels will cache their food, which mainly consists of nuts and tree cones for the winter, and they'll build it up into these huge piles. These can be enormous amounts of seeds, several feet high and several feet in length. I actually had a squirrel building a midden once in my cabin near my cabin in Alaska. It would just go back and forth all day long on the same trail, taking cones and pine nuts back to this midden site. And it would also drop pine cones from the treetops onto my tin roof and wake me up every day at 5 a.m. So I didn't fully appreciate that, but I know that they have to make it through the winter. So this midden pile begins to decompose a bit over the summer months, but the moisture is retained inside because there's also tree bark and leaves kind of falling on top of this pile that keep it nice and moist inside. So it keeps the cones from drying out and opening. So one midden can contain around 15,000 cones, which is really great if a squirrel can hang on to this and actually use that food source throughout the winter. And lots of other animals are drawn to these middens because of the squirrels and because of the resources that they're gathering here. So martens, bobcats, coyotes, owls are all attracted to middens to hunt squirrels. But like I mentioned with bears, who are primarily omnivores, they are also drawn to these middens for the cones themselves. So they'll dig through and fatten up for hibernation, especially in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem when, as I mentioned, they rely really heavily on white bark pine seeds. So grizzly bears and black bears have squirrels to thank for part of their hibernation stock. Oops. Then there's one more species I wanted to highlight, which are ermines or short-tailed weasels. And a lot of this kind of applies to most other weasel species in general. So they change their coat color depending on the time of year. So on the photo on the left is a weasel in its summer coat, kind of that classic brown on top, white on the bottom. And then in the winter, they'll turn this beautiful white color with a black tip at the very end of their tail. So a lot of people think this has to do with snowpack, but it's actually just due to the changing daylight hours as we move from summer to winter. So less daylight hours kind of triggers this physiological response for them to change their coat color to white. So if you kind of think about it, this is also an issue that might arise with climate change, where there's less snowpack earlier in the winter when these weasels are changing their coat color. So they're more exposed to predators, and they don't have that element of camouflage for when they're hunting prey. So this is a slight issue for them. But like I mentioned, most weasels are pretty tenacious hunters. They can take down prey 3 times their size. So weasels often go after snowshoe hares, which are much, much larger than them. And some of them partake in surplus killing, which is just killing more than what they need. So specifically, a lot of this happens in the wintertime. And they do this for a couple different reasons. So they store prey as a buffer for unpredictable winter conditions. If prey populations have kind of dropped and they're not hunting as successfully, they still have this storage of, mice and small rodents to go back and eat on. They're also compensating for fewer prey available during this winter period, and they're also balancing the changing energy levels with the onset of winter. So they're hunting less, they're kind of going into torpor periodically, which is basically like a form of mild hibernation. And they just need to conserve that energy rather than hunt. So they'll kind of use this food storage of small rodents and mice. And they'll actually line the burrows with fur from their prey to insulate themselves underground. So kind of just nesting for the winter. Another interesting fact is that, as with most other mustelid species, weasels experience delayed implantation, which happens throughout the year. So basically, they will mate in late summer and early spring, but the fertilized egg will actually delay implantation for almost a whole year. So they give birth to kits in the spring. They have a gestation period of 4 weeks when food is most plentiful, and then they will give birth to their kits when conditions are more favorable for them. So they'll delay the egg implanting into the uterine wall for almost a full year. Bears also do this, skunks, martens, wolverines, and badgers also go through delayed implantation. So that's all I have for today. Thanks for coming to this talk and letting me chat your ear off about carnivores. I also just have a quick list of some of the papers that I mentioned throughout this talk if you wanted to look them up yourself. And I will open it up for questions.
All right, thank you so much. Now, before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get to some of these questions. Now, is there a good estimate on the number of wolverines that are in the greater Yellowstone area and in Yellowstone itself?
I did read about this number at some point. I can't think of it off the top of my head, actually. Wolverines kind of exist in really low abundance throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and beyond, because they have such large home range sizes. Males especially can have home ranges of up like many, many, many square miles. So they need this large area in order for one wolverine to survive. So they're not found in very dense numbers throughout these ecosystems. But yeah, that's kind of what this monitoring project is trying to figure out as well, is just how many wolverines are actually out there. So in case they need to be listed as endangered.
Do wolverines ever hunt in packs, or do they always hunt solitarily?
Typically, they're more solitary predators. So obviously, like, females and their kits will sometimes be seen together as the kits are growing up. There's been pictures at these bait stations of whole families of wolverines together. But typically, once they hit sexual maturity, they'll go out on their own and then just be pretty much solo, take it solo from there.
Great, thank you. Now, given that Michigan is the Wolverine state, are there wolverines in the wild in the state anymore?
Not really. At least not around Michigan. There's a lot of wolverines kind of just a little bit further north up in Canada, but they're typically more found out west, kind of in more of that, like, those rugged environments where they have mountains and higher elevations to be at. A lot of their habitat requirements need these high elevation areas, mostly because of the snowpack but they're just generally found in higher elevation areas.
Great, thank you. So you showed a picture of a man holding a fisher, a radio-collared fisher. Now, was the fisher sedated, and would it tolerate being held if it wasn't?
Probably not. So yeah, fishers for this project were sedated before they were radio collared. So I'm assuming this is just a picture of a sedated fisher with right after being collared. So sedation is just so it reduces stress for the animals as well. So they typically will not remember being captured by humans after this event, and then they can just be released after waking up and just continue on with their day. So they're not really like struggling with humans during the capture process.
Okay, great, thank you. So, how do brown bears deal with spines on the Devil's Club?
Oh, so bears, particularly the ones that eat Devil's Club in Southeast Alaska, bears have very mobile lips and tongues, so they're able to pick off berries very daintily from these plants. I've watched bears forage on berries in Alaska, and they're very, very particular and gentle when they pick off these berries. They're not just kind of like ripping it off the whole plant. They're very intentional with which berry they want to eat off of a plant. It's pretty fascinating, actually.
That is intriguing, thank you. So one of our guests mentions hearing the terms fission and fusion thrown around regarding coyotes. Do you know what those mean when they're talking about coyotes?
I assume they mean like fission fusion dynamics, like population dynamics. So a lot of the times coyote populations can fluctuate really heavily. So like they might reach a really large population and then kind of shrink if there's not a lot of resources, or if there's more competitors around, they kind of just disperse from an area. And coyotes really have, like I mentioned, a remarkable ability to bounce back after their population takes a hit. But like with most other predators, they kind of self-regulate themselves. They self-regulate their populations. So if they can sense that there's too many of them in an area, typically their populations will naturally just decline from there, or coyotes will disperse and move out to areas where there's more prey availability and less competition. Or if resources are really good and coyotes can adapt and support a large population, then they will typically grow. So I'm assuming that's what they mean.
Great, thank you for addressing that. Now, is it legal to hunt coyotes? Is that something that can be done?
Yeah, so a lot of states actually still have coyote bounties, including my home state of Utah. That I believe there's a $50 bounty on coyotes where all you need to do is turn in like the tail and the lower jaw. And unfortunately, there's actually still wildlife killing contests that go on in a couple states around the United States where people go out and kill as many coyotes as they can, which once again, kind of going back to the population dynamics of coyotes and just how variable their populations are in these ecosystems and their effect on deer populations in particular. So a lot of people think that killing off more coyotes is going to help deer populations, but it kind of has the exact opposite effect. So the more coyotes you kill off in an area, the more are going to move in, the more pups they're going to have. In my opinion, I feel like a lot of these hunting strategies on coyotes are a bit misguided. Just knowing how coyote population dynamics work.
Great, thank you for addressing that. Could you let us know the name of the book that you recommended, The Wolverine Way?
Yes, so here's another picture of it, written by Douglas Chadwick. So he's also written other books such as, I believe, 3/4 a Grizzly, or 3/5 a Grizzly, A Beast the Color of Winter, which is about mountain goats. So he's one of my favorite authors. He just writes really well and talks about his fieldwork days in a very great way. Like it's informative, but it's also told as like a story and a narrative. So The Wolverine Way is one of my favorite books, and I have yet to read the Grizzly book that he wrote, but it's next on my list.
Great, thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming to my first webinar. I definitely want to do more in the future. So you can find me on Instagram at Rylee J Photo. I post a lot of my wildlife photography pictures on there. And you can catch me leading some more NatHab expeditions in the future, particularly around Alaska next year. So I hope to see a couple of you on those tours.
Rylee, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We will see you next time.